My wife cheated on me with my business partners. After finding out, I destroyed the company, took the kids, and posted her nudes online. It all started on a Thursday, just an ordinary workday for James. He'd left the office a bit early since his last meeting got canceled last minute. No big deal, he thought, more time to relax at home. Maybe he'd even catch a quick nap before his wife, Charlotte, got back from work. But as he pulled into the driveway, something immediately felt off. There was a car in the garage, a sleek black Mercedes. It wasn't Charlotte's. His stomach dropped, his heart pounding as a knot formed in his chest. He knew every car in the neighborhood. And this one? Definitely not familiar. And it sure as hell wasn't Charlotte's old Toyota. His mind started racing, though he tried not to jump to any wild conclusions. Maybe Charlotte had a guest over, or maybe there was an innocent explanation. But deep down, James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Instead of going through the garage like he normally would, James quietly crept around to the back door, avoiding the obvious entrance. As soon as he stepped inside, he froze. Voices, faint but unmistakable, coming from upstairs, from the master bedroom. His breath caught in his throat as he stood in the hallway, barely daring to breathe. The sound of Charlotte's laugh drifted down, followed by a man's voice. Another man. In his house. In his bedroom. James felt his blood start to boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. Storming in there like a lunatic would do no good. He needed to know more. Without making a sound, he backed out the door and returned to his car. His hands were shaking as he sat there, trying to think. He could go back in, confront her on the spot, but then what? Charlotte could deny everything, or worse, make him out to be some paranoid fool. No, he needed proof, something she couldn't talk her way out of. He sat there for a few minutes, his mind spinning, until a plan started forming. If she was cheating, he'd make sure they both paid for it. Every last bit of it would come crashing down on them. James had a buddy from college, Mason, who was good with tech. They'd stayed close over the years, and Mason was the kind of guy who never asked too many questions. James knew he could count on him. Later that evening, James gave Mason a call. He kept it casual, said he wanted help upgrading the security system around the house. It wasn't entirely a lie, he just didn't mention the part about catching his wife cheating. The next day, Mason came over with a box full of high-end cameras and microphones, more than enough to cover every room in the house. "Everything all right, man?" Mason asked as they set up the equipment, raising an eyebrow. James shrugged, playing it off. "Yeah, just want to feel a little more secure, you know?" Mason didn't push it. Within an hour, they had tiny cameras hidden in vents under furniture and microphones tucked away in the corners. Charlotte wouldn't notice a thing. For the next week, James watched her like a hawk. Every evening, she came home and acted like nothing was wrong. They ate dinner, watched TV, went to bed like usual. But now, James saw her differently. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she got a text, he couldn't help but wonder who was on the other end. James stepped out of the room to take a call, feeling the anger rise in his chest. Then, 2 days later, he got the confirmation he dreaded. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and James was at work when his phone buzzed. A notification from the hidden camera. Movement detected in the master bedroom. His heart pounded as he pulled up the live feed, and there it was, Charlotte, tangled up with her boss, Liam. The same guy whose car had been parked in their garage that day. The camera captured everything. They were in bed together, laughing, kissing, talking like they didn't have a care in the world. Every word of their conversation made James sick to his stomach. "We should be more careful," Liam said, lighting a cigarette. Charlotte just laughed, rolling over in bed. "He's clueless. James would never suspect a thing." And that was the moment James knew he had to follow through with his plan. They were mocking him, these two. His wife, the woman he'd loved and trusted for years, and her arrogant boss, acting like they were getting away with it. But James wasn't the kind of man to just sit there and let them destroy his life. No, he was going to make them pay. Over the next few days, James doubled down, gathering more evidence. He didn't want just one instance of their affair. He wanted a mountain of proof. He recorded every conversation, every text Charlotte sent to Liam. He even installed a keystroke logger on her laptop to track her emails. Slowly, he built his case, and the more he watched, the more disgusted he became. It wasn't just an affair. They were planning a future together. One conversation in particular hit James hard. Charlotte casually mentioned leaving him. "I'll divorce him soon," she said. Like their marriage meant absolutely nothing. It was a punch to the gut, but James wasn't about to let her call the shots. No, he was going to end things on his own terms. As the days passed, his plan grew darker. It wasn't enough to confront her privately. He didn't just want her to know he knew. He wanted the whole neighborhood to know. She had humiliated him, and now it was her turn to feel that shame. On the morning of the day he'd been planning for weeks, James woke up early. This was it, the day he would reveal everything. The evidence he had was undeniable. Hidden camera footage, transcripts of their conversations, dozens of texts between his wife and her lover. But simply confronting Charlotte wasn't going to cut it. He needed to make a statement. The idea had come to him in a moment of dark inspiration. It wasn't enough to leave her or quietly expose the affair. He wanted to humiliate her just like she had humiliated him. So, he began by moving every piece of furniture from their shared bedroom out onto the front lawn. The bed where she'd betrayed him, the nightstand where she kept her secrets, even the carpet they'd picked out together. It all went out there for everyone to see. James took his time with it, making sure each item was displayed perfectly, like a twisted exhibition for the entire neighborhood. James took his time with the arrangements, making sure everything looked just right. The bed was centered perfectly on the front lawn, headboard facing the street so it would catch the eye of every passing car. Around the bed, he placed a small table and chairs, set up as if it were a cozy bedroom. Only now, it was all out in the open for anyone who cared to stop and look. On the table, he added the final touch, a series of high-resolution, unforgiving photos. They showed Charlotte and Liam together in bed. Alongside the photos, James carefully laid out a sign he'd written, each word deliberate, his hands steady with controlled anger. "This is the bed where my wife, Charlotte, decided to betray me with her boss." Beneath that, he printed out some of their texts, messages filled with intimate plans for the future and cruel jokes at his expense. He made sure the lettering was large, bold, and impossible to miss. Once everything was arranged, James stood back and took it all in. It was exactly as he had imagined. The ultimate display of her betrayal, right out there for the entire neighborhood to see. It didn't take long for people to notice. The first to approach was Karen, the nosy neighbor from across the street. She was in her late 50s, always peeking through her blinds, always the first to know everyone else's business. She marched over, her face a mix of shock and curiosity. "James, what on earth is this?" she asked, her eyes darting between the furniture and the photos. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No," James replied calmly. "It's exactly what it looks like. Charlotte's been cheating on me with her boss. And I'm making sure everyone knows." Karen gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Oh my God. I had no idea." Soon, a few other neighbors started to gather, all drawn in by the spectacle unfolding on James's lawn. Tom, who lived 2 doors down, was out walking his dog when he saw the display. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the bed, the photos, and the giant sign. "Jesus, man," Tom muttered under his breath. "You really went all out." James didn't respond. He didn't need to explain himself. He just wanted the truth out in the open. By mid-morning, a small crowd had started to form. People were slowing their cars as they drove by, some even pulling over to get a better look. Word was spreading fast, and it wasn't long before Lily, Charlotte's best friend, arrived. She looked pale, her hands trembling as she walked up to James. "What are you doing?" she stammered. "This isn't right. You can't just what?" James cut her off, his voice cold. "Tell the truth? Show everyone who she really is? She did this, not me." Lily's face flushed with anger. "But this is humiliating. You're putting her private life on display for the whole world to see." James stepped closer, his expression hard and unyielding. "You think I care about her humiliation after what she did to me?" he asked, his voice cold. She didn't care when she brought that man into our bed, did she? Lily opened her mouth, ready to protest, but no words came out. She looked from James to the photos on the table, her eyes filling with tears. Unable to face the harsh reality of what her friend had done, she turned away in silence. Around noon, Charlotte texted James to let him know she was on her way home, completely unaware of the storm waiting for her. James stood by the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been imagining this moment for weeks, the moment she'd come face to face with everything he'd laid out for the world to see. He heard her car pull into the driveway, the engine cutting off. There was a long, tense pause, then the sound of the car door opening. Charlotte must have seen the bed first, sitting there in the middle of the lawn, then the photos and the sign. A scream pierced the air, raw and filled with panic. A sound James had never heard from her before. "James, what the hell is this?" she shrieked, rushing toward the front door, her voice a mix of shock and desperation. James stood his ground, arms crossed, watching her approach. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide in disbelief as she snatched the photos off the table, staring at them in horror. "Why would you do this?" she cried, her voice breaking. "This is insane. You're insane." James didn't flinch. "I'm not insane, Charlotte. I'm just done with your lies. I'm done pretending everything's fine while you sneak around with him." Charlotte glanced around, as if hoping someone would step in to stop this nightmare from unfolding. But the crowd that had gathered was silent, watching with uncomfortable fascination. Some were even recording on their phones. Others whispered to each other, but no one moved to help her. "I can explain," she shouted, her voice desperate and cracking. "It's not what it looks like." "Oh, really?" James replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Because it looks pretty clear to me. You cheated, Charlotte. You betrayed me. And now everyone knows." Tears streamed down her face as she tried to plead with him, but James had heard enough. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the house, leaving her standing alone on the lawn, surrounded by the undeniable evidence of her infidelity. From inside, James watched through the window. Charlotte collapsed to her knees beside the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Her hands shook as she clutched the photos, unable to process the destruction of her life. Several of the neighbors had started to leave, but a few stayed, still watching the scene unfold. Lily finally stepped forward, kneeling beside her friend. "Come on, Charlotte," she whispered gently. "Let's go inside." But Charlotte shook her head, her gaze locked on the sign. "I can't believe he did this," she muttered, her voice barely audible between the sobs. Just then, Liam arrived. Not long after, Liam pulled up in his sleek black Mercedes, the same car James had seen in his garage on that first, gut-wrenching day. His face was pale, his eyes wide as he took in the spectacle on the lawn. He knew instantly there was no talking his way out of this. Without hesitating, he rushed toward Charlotte, ignoring the eyes of the neighbors now locked on him. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice barely holding back panic. Charlotte didn't answer. She just pointed weakly to the sign and the photos strewn across the lawn. Liam's face drained of color as he realized the full extent of James's revenge. "James did this." His voice dropped, filled with disbelief, and maybe even fear. Charlotte nodded, still sobbing. "He knows everything, Liam. It's over." Liam cursed under his breath, raking a shaky hand through his hair. "We've got to get out of here. Now." He grabbed Charlotte's arm, yanking her up, trying to make her move. "Come on, let's go." But Charlotte couldn't move. She stood frozen, her body trembling with shame, her eyes locked on the photos, the sign, the eyes of the neighbors burning into her. She was paralyzed by the weight of it all. Frustrated, Liam pulled her toward the car. But before they could make it far, James stepped out of the house one last time, his face stone cold. "Oh, Liam," James called, his voice dripping with mockery. It stopped them dead in their tracks. "Don't forget this." He threw another stack of photos into the air. They scattered across the lawn, fluttering like a twisted confetti, exposing more damning moments, more betrayal. The wind carried them in every direction, an unrelenting reminder of their lies. Liam turned, glaring at James with murderous eyes, but he didn't say a word. He knew there was nothing left to say. His grip tightened on Charlotte as he led her to the car. James stood still, watching them. As they pulled away, a dark satisfaction began to creep over him. It wasn't the closure he thought he'd feel, but it was enough. Charlotte was gone, and now the entire neighborhood knew what kind of person she truly was. He turned, walking back into the house, closing the door behind him with a finality that felt like a release. For the first time in months, James felt something he hadn't in a long time: control. A few days later, James sat in his lawyer's office, his decision solid as stone. The evidence he had, photos, videos, texts, was enough to burn it all down. His attorney, Patrick, scanned the documents, nodding grimly as he flipped through the damning proof. "This much evidence?" Patrick said, shaking his head. "It'll be an easy case. Charlotte won't be able to contest a thing." James didn't react. He stared blankly at the wall, his thoughts not on the divorce itself, but on what came next. This wasn't just about ending his marriage. It was about destroying everything Charlotte and Liam had built on their lies. He was going to make sure they both paid dearly for what they'd done. Patrick cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You okay with this?" James nodded slowly. There was no joy in knowing how easy this would be, only a cold, burning resolve. Charlotte wasn't just going to lose her marriage. She was going to lose everything. The divorce was just the beginning. The next step, exposing Liam's betrayal to his own wife. With that thought seared in his mind, James left the lawyer's office with a thick envelope of evidence in hand. He drove across town, the tension in his chest building with every mile. This wasn't over yet. He was going to make sure Sarah, Liam's wife, knew exactly what kind of man she was married to. He had met Sarah a few times at company events. She had always been kind, smiling warmly whenever they spoke. And now her world was about to come crashing down. She had no idea what Liam had been doing behind her back, and James knew that she deserved to know the full truth. He pulled up outside their house, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. This was it, the final piece in his plan. No one was going to walk away from this without consequences. Not Charlotte, not Liam, not after what they did. James opened the door to find Sarah standing there, her face filled with confusion as she met his gaze. "James, what brings you here?" she asked, surprised by his unannounced visit. Without a word, James handed her the envelope. Her hands trembled as she tore it open, her expression twisting in horror as she flipped through the damning photos of her husband, Liam, entangled with Charlotte. The texts followed, their words undeniable proof of the betrayal. Her voice broke, barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. How long has this been going on?" "Months," James replied flatly. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way." Tears streamed down her face as she sank onto the couch, her legs giving out beneath her. She stared at the floor, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. Liam had betrayed her, and now the whole world knew. Sarah's reaction was swift. Within days, she filed for divorce just as James had. She used the same evidence, photos, texts, videos, to build her case. Liam's life began to spiral out of control, starting with the collapse of his marriage. At work, the rumors spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for the affair between Liam and Charlotte to reach the ears of his superiors. The company had a strict policy against relationships between employees, especially those involving a power imbalance. Liam had crossed a line, and now there were serious consequences. One morning, Liam was called into a meeting with Diane, the head of human resources. Her tone was firm, her expression cold. "Your position here is no longer tenable," she told him. "The company can't afford the risk of this scandal damaging our reputation." He was given no choice but to resign. Liam walked out of the office, his career in ruins. Back at home, Charlotte's life was unraveling just as fast. After James had exposed their affair so publicly, her reputation was in tatters. She couldn't escape the whispers or the judgmental stares from neighbors and friends. Even those closest to her began to distance themselves, uncomfortable with the scandal that now clung to her name. A week after Liam's fall from grace, Charlotte lost her job too. The official reason given was unprofessional conduct, but everyone knew the real reason. She had become a liability. Her once stable, comfortable life was crumbling, piece by piece. One night, Charlotte showed up at James's door. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked like a ghost of the confident woman James had married years ago. "Please, James," she begged, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I made a horrible mistake. Can we just talk about this?" James stared at her, his expression hard and unyielding. "Talk about what, Charlotte? How you lied to me for months. How you slept with your boss in our home. What exactly is there to talk about?" Tears welled up in her eyes again. "I know I hurt you. I know I've done terrible things, but I've lost everything. My job, my friends. I don't even have Liam anymore. I've got nothing left." James crossed his arms, unmoved. "You should have thought about that before you decided to betray me." Charlotte's lip quivered. I know I was wrong. But I'm begging you, James. Please, can't we try to fix this? I'll do anything." James's eyes stayed cold as he stood in the doorway, unmoving. "There's nothing left to fix, Charlotte. You destroyed it all." With those final words, he stepped back, closing the door on her once and for all. James looked down at Charlotte, her face crumpled in despair, sobbing uncontrollably at his feet. "I don't know what to do anymore," she wailed, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, James. I'll do anything to make it up to you. Please, just don't throw me away like this." But James wasn't swayed by her tears. Not anymore. He had heard enough empty apologies. His voice was calm, firm. "I'm not the one who threw us away, Charlotte. You did. You made your choices, and now you're dealing with the consequences." She collapsed fully onto the porch, her body shaking with sobs, her pride completely shattered. For a fleeting moment, James felt a twinge of pity, seeing her so broken. But the feeling quickly passed. He had given her everything, and she had destroyed it. There was no going back. Without another word, James turned and walked inside, closing the door behind him. He could still hear her crying on the front steps, but instead of anger or sadness, James felt something else. Peace. It was over. His marriage had crumbled, but for the first time in months he felt free. No more lies, no more betrayal, just the quiet certainty that he had made the right decision. Charlotte's downfall was complete. She had lost everything. Her marriage, her job, her lover, and her dignity. As she finally picked herself up from James's porch, wiping her tear-stained face, the cold reality hit her. She had no one left to turn to. The life she had built on lies had crumbled to dust, and now she was truly alone. Meanwhile, Liam's life continued its downward spiral. His savings drained quickly, and rejection letters from job applications stacked higher by the day. Desperate, he reached out to old business contacts, people who once admired him, but one by one they turned him down, citing his tarnished reputation. His affair with Charlotte had not only destroyed his marriage but left him untouchable in the corporate world. With no steady income, Liam was forced to sell his prized Mercedes and move into a small, shabby apartment far from the upscale neighborhood he used to call home. As for James, he focused on keeping life as stable as possible for his children, Evan and Olivia. Though his heart still ached from the betrayal, he refused to let that pain cloud his ability to be a good father. He worked tirelessly to restore a sense of normalcy in their lives, filling the house with laughter and warmth. Evan loved basketball, so James started taking him to weekend games, cheering him on from the sidelines. Olivia, on the other hand, had a passion for painting, and James transformed a corner of the living room into a mini art studio just for her. James's own happiness still felt out of reach, but watching his children thrive brought him a small sense of comfort. He had lost his marriage, but he still had them, and they gave him a reason to keep moving forward. Meanwhile, Charlotte had become a shadow of the woman she once was. Her new apartment felt cold and empty, a far cry from the vibrant home she had once shared with her family. She applied for jobs, but her name was blacklisted in most professional circles. She had been labeled as the woman who destroyed her family for an affair, and that stigma followed her everywhere she went. There were nights when she would sit alone in the dark, haunted by the choices she had made, realizing just how far she had fallen from the life she once had. No more family, no more respect, just the cold reality of the consequences she had brought on herself. Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through old family photos on her phone. Tears fell silently as the weight of what she had done pressed down on her chest. The regret was suffocating, but she knew deep inside that there was no going back. James wasn't ready to forgive her, and every brief encounter they had during their handoffs with the kids made that painfully clear. His eyes, once filled with warmth, were now cold and distant. He was civil, but it was only for Evan and Olivia's sake. The softness they had once shared was gone. She realized with a sinking heart that James was gone from her life for good. As the months passed, Sarah, Liam's ex-wife, had been slowly rebuilding her life. After filing for divorce, she threw herself into her work and began therapy to heal from the trauma of Liam's betrayal. At first, she had been blindsided by the pain, but over time, her sorrow transformed into a quiet strength. She was determined not to let Liam's betrayal define her, so she focused on herself and her future. During this period of healing, Sarah found herself thinking more and more about James. They had shared a similar heartache, and that shared experience had formed a strange bond between them. At first, they exchanged occasional text messages about their divorce proceedings, brief updates and formalities. But as time passed, their conversations became longer and more personal. They spoke about their children, the struggles of moving forward, and the small victories of regaining control of their lives. Slowly, their shared pain became a bridge, connecting them in unexpected ways. One evening, James invited Sarah over for dinner. It wasn't a planned event. He had simply made too much food and thought it would be nice to have someone to talk to. Sarah accepted the invitation, and when she arrived, for the first time in a long while, there was genuine laughter in James's home that wasn't just for the kids. They talked late into the night, sharing stories about their past, their hopes for the future, and the challenges they had faced. As the hours passed, something shifted between them. It wasn't immediate, but over time, their friendship began to evolve into something deeper. Both of them were cautious. James was still haunted by what Charlotte had done, and Sarah was hesitant to open her heart after Liam's betrayal. But the connection they shared felt authentic, grounded in honesty and mutual respect. There was no pretense, only understanding. Eventually, James and Sarah began dating. It wasn't easy. The scars they both carried ran deep, and the fear of being hurt again lingered in the background. But they took things slowly, focused on building trust and creating a foundation that neither of them had experienced in their past relationships. Their children, Sarah's Emma and Sam, and James's Evan and Olivia, got along well, and their blended family gradually started to feel like home. Meanwhile, the legal battles with their exes continued. Charlotte had been relentless in trying to secure more custody of the children, arguing that while she had made mistakes, she was still their mother. But James wasn't willing to let her back into their lives in any significant way. He knew that the stability and peace he had finally created for Evan and Olivia could be easily shattered if Charlotte regained more control. To him, her mistakes weren't just errors in judgment. They were choices that had torn their family apart. He was determined to protect his children from further harm, knowing that the person Charlotte had become wasn't someone he wanted them exposed to regularly. As James and Sarah continued to rebuild their lives together, the love they found was not just a healing from their past, but a quiet celebration of second chances, of knowing they had both endured betrayal, yet managed to find hope and love again in each other's arms. Additional involvement from Charlotte would only destabilize the peace James had worked so hard to build for his children. He had no intention of letting her drag them back into the chaos she had caused. On the other hand, Liam's downfall had gone even further. After losing his job, he attempted to sue his former company, claiming wrongful termination. But the company had mountains of evidence documenting his inappropriate relationship with Charlotte, which clearly violated their workplace policies. His lawsuit quickly fell apart, leaving him with nothing but the wreckage of his life. The final turning point came when James and Sarah decided to take things further, legally. Together, they gathered all the evidence they had, not just of the affair but also of Liam's and Charlotte's attempts to manipulate the situation. They had lied, tried to cover up their actions, and caused emotional and financial havoc. James and Sarah, with the help of their lawyers, built a case that went beyond custody. They were seeking accountability for the emotional distress and financial damage both Liam and Charlotte had inflicted. When the case went to court, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Liam and Charlotte did their best to defend their actions, but they were clearly cornered. Their lawyers tried to paint them as people who had simply made mistakes, but the overwhelming evidence told a different story. The judge was not sympathetic. James and Sarah's legal team presented a compelling case, showing in detail how the affair had devastated both families, emotionally and financially. The judge ruled decisively in their favor, awarding James full custody of Evan and Olivia, and Sarah full custody of Emma and Sam. But that wasn't the end of the trial. James and Sarah had also filed for damages, arguing that the emotional toll of the affair had caused lasting harm and that Liam and Charlotte should be held financially responsible. The judge agreed. Liam and Charlotte were ordered to pay significant reparations, a crushing blow for both of them, especially since neither could afford the payments. When the trial finally ended, Liam and Charlotte stood outside the courthouse, broken and defeated. Their lives were in tatters not just because of the affair, but because of the heavy consequences that followed. Everything they had tried to hide had come to light, and now they were left with nothing. As James and Sarah walked out of the courthouse, hand in hand, they knew they had truly won. They had stood up for themselves, for their children, and they had come out stronger on the other side. The future now looked different, brighter. James and Sarah moved forward, blending their families and building a new life together. Their children, Evan, Olivia, Emma, and Sam, thrived in the stable, loving environment they created. Though the pain of the past lingered like an old scar, it no longer defined them. They had built something new from the wreckage, and in each other, they found a second chance at happiness. James and Sarah's new life was far from ordinary. After the trial, they knew they were stronger not only as individuals but as a family. Their pasts had been filled with betrayal and heartbreak, but their future was one of hope, resilience, and a love that had grown out of shared struggle. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of their old lives, and now, they could look forward to a future free from the weight of their pasts. The blended family had settled into a somewhat peaceful rhythm. Evan, Olivia, Emma, and Sam had grown close, forming bonds that seemed to heal old wounds faster than anyone expected. Life was moving forward for James and Sarah, and for the first time in a long while there was a sense of normalcy. But beneath the surface of this new chapter, the shadows of the past lingered, waiting for the right moment to strike back. It all started when James and Sarah decided to move into a new house together. With their growing, combined family, they needed more space, and they found the perfect home just outside the city. A spacious house with plenty of room for the kids to grow and a backyard that stretched into the horizon. It felt like a fresh start, a place where they could finally breathe. But strange things began happening shortly after they moved in. One night, as James was unpacking boxes in the garage, his car alarm went off. He rushed outside but found nothing. No one was near the car. Shrugging it off as a glitch, he reset the alarm and went back to work. The next day, Sarah discovered a note taped to their front door. It was cryptic, just 2 chilling words. "You'll pay." At first, they dismissed it as a prank, perhaps some neighborhood kids messing with the newcomers. But things quickly escalated. The notes kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. Someone started ringing their doorbell in the dead of night, disappearing before anyone could answer. Their security cameras captured fleeting glimpses of a figure lurking around the house, but the person was always masked, making identification impossible. Tension grew in the household. James and Sarah were on edge but didn't want to frighten the kids. Quietly, they decided to hire a private investigator, Max Harper. Max was a seasoned, no-nonsense former detective in his late 40s, known for cracking difficult cases. He dove into the investigation, combing through the security footage, interviewing neighbors, and digging into both Liam's and Charlotte's whereabouts. It didn't take long before Max uncovered something disturbing. Liam had recently been spotted in town, hanging around with some unsavory characters. After losing everything in the trial, his career, his home, and his dignity, Liam had spiraled into a deep depression. Rumors were swirling that he had gotten involved with a local criminal syndicate to make ends meet. He was in debt, and it was the kind of debt that didn't come with easy solutions. It wasn't just bitterness over losing his marriage and career anymore. Liam was desperate. Desperation had driven him into dangerous waters, and Max suspected that the menacing notes and mysterious disturbances might be tied to Liam's new connections. Max also uncovered that Charlotte, despite her ruined life, had started visiting Liam again. They weren't back together romantically, but she was caught up in his mess, almost as if she couldn't escape the chaos they had created together. She had no job, no money, and she was clinging to whatever remnants of familiarity she had left, even if it was dragging her deeper into the darkness. Liam's new world was toxic, and Charlotte had somehow become entangled in it, whether by choice or circumstance. As the pieces started to come together, James and Sarah realized that their peaceful new life was under siege, and the threat was much closer than they had anticipated. Liam, fueled by anger, desperation, and dangerous influences, wasn't ready to let go. And Charlotte, whether she intended it or not, was right there with him, trapped in a web of deceit and destruction. With Max's findings, James and Sarah knew they had to act fast before the situation escalated any further. Pulling Charlotte in, even against her will, Liam had dragged her deeper into his dark world. Then came the first real act of violence. One evening, as Sarah was driving home with the kids, a brick came crashing through the windshield. The kids screamed as shards of glass sprayed into the car. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the terror was palpable. James was furious. He had tried to stay calm through the anonymous threats and the unsettling occurrences around the house. But now, his family had been physically endangered. He immediately called Max, who didn't mince words. "This isn't just intimidation anymore," Max warned. "It's a message." Max intensified his investigation, tracking Liam's every move. It wasn't long before the truth came to light. Liam had hired someone. A local thug named Ryan, known for his dirty work, had been tasked with terrorizing James and Sarah. Liam wanted revenge, but he didn't have the nerve to do it himself. Instead, he paid Ryan to handle it for him, hoping that if they made life miserable enough for James and Sarah, they'd eventually back down or even leave town. When Max brought this information to James, his voice was grim. "Liam's crossed a line. This isn't about scaring you anymore. He's desperate, and desperate men do stupid things. We need to be careful." James nodded in agreement, but he wasn't going to sit idly by, waiting for Liam to make the next move. He and Sarah decided to take their own precautions. They installed more cameras, reinforced their security system, and made sure the kids were never left alone. But despite their preparations, they knew they couldn't live in fear forever. Just a week later, things took an even darker turn. Max dug deeper into Ryan's background and uncovered something chilling. Ryan wasn't just a hired thug. He had a personal vendetta against James. Years ago, James had unknowingly been involved in a business deal that led to Ryan's father losing his company. Ryan had held a grudge ever since, blaming James for his family's downfall, even though James hadn't done anything wrong. Now, with Liam's money and influence, Ryan saw the perfect opportunity to exact his own revenge. One night, Max's investigation led him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He had been following Ryan after spotting him acting suspiciously near James and Sarah's home. When Max arrived at the warehouse, he overheard an argument between Ryan and Liam. Liam was panicking. He wanted out, realizing things had gone too far. But Ryan wasn't backing down. He didn't just want to scare James anymore. He wanted blood, James's blood, and he was willing to go to any lengths to get it. Max immediately called James, his voice urgent. "You need to get your family out of the house now. You're not safe. Ryan's planning something big." James didn't hesitate. He rushed home, gathering Sarah and the kids, and whisked them away to a hotel for the night under Max's protection. But even there, the feeling of safety was fleeting. They knew that as long as Liam and Ryan were out there, they couldn't truly be safe. The next morning, Max called with more bad news. Their house had been broken into during the night. The place had been ransacked. Drawers were torn open, furniture overturned, and personal belongings scattered everywhere. Though it seemed like a reckless act of vandalism, the message was clear. James and Sarah were being hunted. The clock was ticking, and they had to put an end to this nightmare before it escalated even further. Furniture was overturned. Family photos lay shattered on the floor. But this wasn't just a burglary. Messages had been spray-painted on the walls in bold, blood-red letters. "You can't hide, and we will find you," scrawled across the living room. It was clear Ryan was escalating and fast. That afternoon, Max came to James with a plan. "We can't keep running," Max said, his voice steady. "We need to confront this head-on. I've been digging into Ryan's history, and I think I found a way to trap him." Max explained that Ryan had a history of violence, and there were outstanding warrants for his arrest. If they could lure him into making a move, they could involve the authorities and put an end to his reign of terror once and for all. But it was risky. Ryan was unpredictable and armed. James, after discussing it with Sarah, agreed to the plan. That evening, Max and James set up the trap, baiting Ryan by letting him believe that James and Sarah had returned to the house. Max wired the house with cameras and arranged for a police sting operation, setting the stage for Ryan to take the bait. It didn't take long. Just after midnight, Ryan broke into the house again, this time armed with a gun. He stormed inside, shouting James's name, taunting him. But what Ryan didn't know was that the police were already positioned outside, watching his every move. The moment he stepped inside, they moved in, surrounding the house. There was a brief, tense standoff. Ryan, realizing he was outnumbered and cornered, eventually dropped the gun and surrendered. The nightmare, at least in part, was over. Liam was arrested the next day, charged with conspiracy and hiring Ryan to carry out the attacks. The trial that followed was long and grueling. Liam's defense attempted to paint him as a man who had been manipulated by Ryan, but the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages, bank transfers, and threats, all of it pointed back to Liam. Charlotte, having been dragged into the mess by her continued association with Liam, was called to testify. Though she tried to distance herself from the worst of it, she admitted under oath that she had been present during several of Liam's meetings with Ryan, claiming fear had kept her from stopping it. Her testimony, while damaging to Liam, further cemented her isolation. James and Sarah sat together in the courtroom, watching as their exes faced the consequences of their actions. It was a surreal moment for both of them. After all the pain, the betrayal, and the terror, they were finally seeing justice served. In the end, both Liam and Ryan were sentenced to long prison terms. Ryan for his role in the violent attacks, and Liam for orchestrating them. Charlotte, while spared from prison time, was left utterly alone. Her life in ruins, her reputation destroyed. When the trial concluded, James and Sarah walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, feeling a long-awaited sense of closure. The threats were finally over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they could move forward. Life didn't go back to normal immediately, but it slowly settled into a new kind of peace. Together, they rebuilt their home, focusing on raising their children in a safe, loving environment, free from the shadows of their past. They had been through hell and back, but through it all, they had found each other. And for them, that was enough.